Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a sound that follows you everywhere aboard an Imperial battleship. It is not any single noise, not the grinding of gears, or the hiss of steam, or the low thrum of plasma reactors burning somewhere far beneath your feet. It is all of these things at once, layered together into a single continuous vibration that seeps through the metal walls and the deck plates and the very air you breathe. After a while, you stop hearing it. After a longer while, you forget what silence ever sounded like. And after years, decades, perhaps even a lifetime spent walking these corridors and climbing these ladders and sleeping in these narrow bunks, that sound becomes the rhythm of your heart. It becomes the only lullaby you have ever known. Imagine, if you will, a city. Not a pleasant city with parks and fountains and open skies overhead, but a city built in the gut of some vast metal leviathan, stretched out across 8 kilometers of adamantium and plasteel and ceramite, stacked dozens of levels high, and populated by hundreds of thousands of souls who may never see the light of a natural star for as long as they live. Imagine that this city moves, that it drifts through the black emptiness between worlds at speeds that would make your mind ache to comprehend, that it carries within its belly enough firepower to crack a continent and enough sorrow to fill an ocean. That is what an Imperial battleship is. Not merely a weapon of war, though it is certainly that. Not merely a vessel for traversing the void, though it serves that purpose as well. It is a world unto itself, a breathing, creaking, groaning habitat where human beings are born and live and work and worship and suffer and die, often without ever setting foot on solid ground. Today, we are going to walk through that world together. We are going to descend from the gilded command decks where officers dine on meals served by personal attendants, down through the bustling mid-decks where skilled voidsmen maintain the arteries and organs of this metal beast, further still to the gun decks where indentured laborers haul shells the size of cargo containers with bleeding hands and breaking backs, and finally into the deep places, the bilge decks and forgotten holds, where things live that have not seen the light of the upper decks in generations. We are going to breathe the recycled air and taste the metallic tang of it on our tongues. But we are going to listen to the prayers that echo through cavernous chapels and the screams that echo through places where no priest has ventured in living memory. We are going to understand, as much as any outsider ever can, what it means to live and die aboard one of the Imperium's greatest creations. So settle in, let the hum of the engines carry you, and let me tell you about a world that most citizens of the Imperium will never see, but upon which the survival of everything they know depends. There is a tradition among the oldest void-born families, the ones who have crewed the same vessel for so many generations, that their blood runs as cold and metallic as the ship's own coolant fluid. When a child is born in the lower decks, the mother places the infant's ear against the nearest bulkhead wall and whispers a name. Not the child's name, the ship's name, because the ship came first, and the ship will remain long after this small life has burned out like a candle in the recycled wind. The child must know from its first breath that it belongs to something far larger and far older than itself, and that this belonging is both a blessing and a burden that will never be set down. I mention this because it speaks to something fundamental about the relationship between a battleship and its crew. These are not people who happen to be aboard a ship. These are people who are part of the ship, as much a component of its functioning as any plasma conduit or gun battery. Their lives are shaped by its rhythms, their identities are forged in its corridors, and their deaths, when they come, are most often caused by its demands. To understand life aboard a battleship is to understand this relationship, this strange and sometimes terrible symbiosis between human flesh and Imperial iron. To understand life aboard an Imperial battleship, you must first understand the sheer, staggering, almost incomprehensible scale of the thing itself. We throw around words like large and massive so casually in everyday language that they lose their meaning, but there is no casual way to describe a vessel that stretches 8 kilometers from its armored prow to the bank of drive nozzles that glow white-hot at its stern. 8 kilometers. That is not a ship in any way you or I might traditionally think of one. That is the distance you might drive from one end of a small town to the other. That is a walk that would take a fit person roughly an hour and a half to complete on open, as level ground, and the corridors of a battleship are neither open nor level. They twist and branch and dead-end and loop back upon themselves in ways that confuse even experienced voidsmen. Entire sections of the ship exist that have not been visited by any authorized crew member in centuries, sealed behind blast doors that rust has fused shut, or simply forgotten by the generations of administrators who have tried and failed to maintain complete records of the vessel's internal geography. The width of such a vessel can reach well over a kilometer at its broadest point, and the ship rises through dozens upon dozens of distinct deck levels, each one a world of its own, with its own atmosphere, its own culture, and its own unspoken rules. If you stood at the very bottom of the ship's keel and looked up through the layered decking above you, assuming such a thing were even possible, you would be gazing upward through a distance comparable to standing at the base of a mountain and looking toward its summit. The structural comparisons are not merely poetic. A battleship of the Emperor class or the Retribution class is, in terms of sheer enclosed volume, larger than many hive spires. It contains more living space than some small orbital stations, and its population can range anywhere from 250,000 souls on the more efficiently crewed vessels to well over 1 million on the older, more labor-intensive designs that the Imperium still relies upon, because no one alive fully understands how to build their equal. These numbers deserve a moment of reflection. 1 million people living inside a single ship. That is not a crew in the way a modern naval vessel has a crew. That is a civilization, a self-contained society with its own hierarchies and economies and traditions and grudges and love affairs and power struggles and religious movements and criminal underworlds. The people who live aboard these ships are not merely passing through. Many of them were born here. Their parents were born here. Their grandparents were born here. There are families aboard Imperial battleships whose bloodlines have served the same vessel for so many generations that they cannot trace their ancestry back to any planet at all. They are void-born, children of the ship, and the ship is all they have ever known. Think about what that means for a moment. Imagine growing up in a world where the sky is a metal ceiling 20 meters above your head, where the ground beneath your feet hums with a vibration that never stops, but where the air tastes faintly of machine oil and incense and the recycled breath of 100,000 other people. Imagine that your entire universe consists of corridors and chambers and access tunnels and the occasional viewport through which you might glimpse the stars, if you are lucky enough to live on a deck that has one, which most people are not. That is the reality for the vast majority of those who call an Imperial battleship home. The ship itself is ancient. This is another thing that must be understood before we go any further. These are not new vessels fresh from some gleaming shipyard. The construction of an Imperial battleship is an undertaking that can span decades or even centuries. It is carried out in the massive orbital docks above forge worlds like Mars or Cypra Mundi by armies of tech priests and servitors and laborers whose grandchildren may be the ones to see the vessel's completion. The designs are often thousands of years old, based on templates that were already ancient when the Horus heresy tore the galaxy apart 10,000 years ago. Some of the battleships still serving the Imperial Navy today were built during the Great Crusade itself, their keels laid down in an age when the Emperor still walked among men. These vessels have been repaired and refitted and modified and patched together so many times over the millennia that very little of their original structure may remain, like the philosophical thought experiment about the ship whose planks are replaced one by one until none of the original wood is left. And except in this case, the planks are adamantium hull plates, and the replacement process involves thousands of tech priests chanting binary prayers while they weld new sections into place. This antiquity is not merely a curiosity, it has profound implications for daily life aboard the vessel. It means that the ship's internal layout is often bewilderingly inconsistent, with sections built in different eras using different design philosophies connected by passages that were never part of any original plan. It means that the ship's systems rely on technologies that may no longer be fully understood by the Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests who maintain them, leading to maintenance rituals that blend genuine engineering with superstitious ceremony in ways that would seem absurd to anyone from a more rational age, but which seem to work. And that is what matters aboard a battleship. It means that there are sections of the ship that are simply forbidden because the machinery within them is so old and so poorly understood that tampering with it might have catastrophic consequences that no one can predict. And it means that the ship has a personality. Not in the metaphorical sense that sailors throughout human history have attributed personality to their vessels, though that tradition certainly continues in the 41st millennium. In a more literal sense, the ancient cogitator systems and interlocking machine spirits that manage the ship's countless automated functions create something that behaves, from the outside, very much like a living intelligence. The tech priests speak of the ship's machine spirit with genuine reverence, and crew members who have served aboard the same vessel for years learn its moods and rhythms the way a farmer learns the moods of the weather. There are days when systems run smoothly and the lights burn steady and the air recyclers hum their quiet song without complaint. And there are days when nothing works quite right, when doors stick and lifts malfunction, and strange sounds echo through corridors where no one walks, as if the ship itself is restless, dreaming fitfully in its ancient iron sleep. The architecture of the vessel reflects the Imperium's soul in ways both grand and unsettling. Gothic arches frame the main thoroughfares, their stonework, actual quarried stone brought aboard during construction and cemented into place over metal frames, are carved with the likenesses of saints and heroes whose names have been worn smooth by the passage of millennia and the touch of countless hands reaching out to brush them for luck. Flying buttresses support the ceilings of the larger chambers, unnecessary from a purely structural standpoint, given the strength of the adamantium framework beneath, but present because the builders of these vessels understood that human beings need beauty as much as they need oxygen, and that a ship which feeds the soul as well as the body will be served more faithfully than one which does not. The corridors of the upper decks are wide enough for 3 people to walk abreast, their walls panelled in dark metal that has been polished to a soft sheen by generations of servitor-driven cleaning machines. Lumens set into the ceiling cast a warm, amber light that softens the hard edges of the surrounding metal and gives the passageways an almost inviting quality. Imperial Aquilus, the twin-headed eagle that serves as the symbol of the Imperium, are worked into the decoration everywhere, stamped into door frames and etched into floor plates and mounted in bronze relief above every major intersection. Banners hang from the rafters, some of them originals that date back centuries, their fabrics stiff and discolored with age, bearing the names and honors of campaigns that have long since passed from living memory into the static records of the ship's historical archives. The lower decks are a different world entirely. Here, the corridors narrow to the point where 2 people can barely pass each other without turning sideways, while the ceiling drops until a tall man must stoop to avoid striking his head on the pipes and conduits that run along the overhead in tangled skeins. The light, where it exists at all, comes from bare lumen strips that flicker and buzz with the uncertain energy of systems that are maintained only when they fail completely and ignored the rest of the time. The walls are bare metal, unpainted, stained with condensation and rust and substances that no one particularly wants to identify. The air down here is thicker, warmer, and carries an undertone of organic smell that is the inevitable product of thousands of human bodies living in close quarters with limited ventilation. Between these 2 extremes lies the vast middle territory of the ship, the working decks where the majority of the crew spends the majority of their time. These areas have a character all their own, neither grand nor squalid, but functional in a way that speaks of pragmatic compromise between the needs of the ship and the needs of the people who serve it. The corridors are wide enough for foot traffic and the occasional cargo trolley, lined with access panels and junction boxes and the endless labeling system, written in a combination of high Gothic, low Gothic, and technical symbology that only makes sense if you grew up reading it. That tells experienced crew members exactly where they are and which systems run behind the walls around them. Moving through the ship is an experience that varies enormously depending on where you are and what level you occupy in the hierarchy. The upper decks have lift systems, are maglev platforms that carry officers and authorized personnel between levels in relative comfort. The middle decks have ladderways, vertical shafts fitted with metal rungs that crew members climb up and down dozens of times during a single shift, their hands growing calloused and their legs growing strong from the constant vertical movement. The lower decks have whatever the people there have managed to improvise. Rope ladders, crude elevators rigged from salvaged pulleys and cable, and in some sections, nothing at all, forcing inhabitants to navigate between levels by climbing the framework of the ship itself, swinging from beam to beam, like the primates that humanity's ancestors were before they reached for the stars and found them full of things that wanted to eat them. There are sections of certain battleships that have developed their own names over the centuries, informal designations that appear on no official chart, but are known to every crew member who has served more than a few months aboard. The throat might be a particularly narrow access corridor that connects two major sections of the ship, named for the sensation of being swallowed that people experience when they walk through it. The graveyard might be a decommissioned berthing section where the bunks still stand, but no one has been assigned to them in generations, the mattresses reduced to dust, and the personal lockers standing open and empty like so many tiny coffins. The cathedral might be a natural void in the ship's structure, where the convergence of several large passages creates an accidental open space with an unexpectedly high ceiling, and where the acoustics are such that a whisper at one end can be heard clearly at the other, making it a popular gathering place for informal meetings and illicit transactions. These unofficial names are part of the ship's oral tradition, passed from veteran crew members to newcomers in the same way that knowledge was transmitted in pre-literate societies, through story and repetition and the gradual accumulation of shared experience. They represent a layer of knowledge about the ship that exists entirely outside the official records, a shadow geography that maps not just the physical space of the vessel, but its social landscape as well, marking the places where deals are made, where fights are settled, where lovers meet, where the dead are remembered, and where the living come to make sense of the lives they lead within these iron walls. All of this, the scale, the antiquity, the strange quasi-life of its machine spirit, the layered geography that reflects millennia of human habitation, forms the backdrop against which every human story aboard the vessel plays out. Whether you are the ship's captain gazing down from your command throne at the vast bridge spread out before you, or a press-ganged conscript chained to a macro-cannon loading mechanism in the sweltering darkness of a gun deck, your life is shaped by the reality of existing inside this thing, this impossible, beautiful, terrible monument to humanity's refusal to surrender the stars. Well, let us begin where all authority begins aboard an Imperial battleship, at the top. The command decks of a battleship occupy the uppermost sections of the vessel, typically positioned high in the ship's superstructure, where they enjoy the best sensor coverage and the most protection from enemy fire coming from below. To reach them, you must ascend through increasingly restricted levels of security, passing through checkpoints manned by armsmen in black carapace armor who scrutinize your identification papers and the purity seals that mark you as authorized to be where you are. The higher you climb, the wider the corridors become, the cleaner the air tastes, and the more the architecture shifts from the utilitarian functionality of the lower decks to something grander, something almost beautiful. At the bridge of an Imperial battleship is a cathedral of command. There is no other way to describe it. It is vast, often spanning dozens of meters in width and stretching even further in length. Its vaulted ceiling rising high enough overhead that the incense smoke from the perpetual censers drifts upward and gathers in thin grey clouds among the iron rafters. Stained glass viewports filter the light of distant stars into colored patterns that shift and change as the ship moves through the void. Gothic columns line the walkways, carved with images of past captains and famous victories and scenes from Imperial scripture. Banks of hololithic displays and cogitator stations fill the lower levels of the bridge, each one attended by officers and servitors and lex mechanics who monitor the ship's systems and translate the flood of data into information that human minds can process. At the center of it all, raised above the bustle of the bridge crew on a dais of polished stone, sits the command throne. This is where the ship's captain presides, a figure of absolute authority whose word is law for every soul aboard. An Imperial Navy captain is not merely a military officer. Within the confines of their vessel, they are judge and governor and priest and warlord all at once. They can order a crew member flogged for dereliction of duty. They can pardon a convicted criminal if they believe the man's skills are needed. They can authorize the execution of a mutineer without trial. And they can promote the humblest rating to a position of authority if circumstances demand it. The captain's power is, for all practical purposes, absolute, checked only by the authority of the fleet admiral above them and the watchful eye of the ship's commissar, who exists to ensure that the captain's loyalty to the Imperium never wavers. The quarters of the ship's captain and senior officers occupy entire sections of the command decks, and they are, by the standards of a warship, remarkably luxurious. A captain's stateroom might include a bedroom larger than many HAB units on a hive world, furnished with genuine wood furniture, imported from some distant agri-world, hung with paintings and tapestries that depict the ship's history, and equipped with a private bathing chamber that uses actual water rather than the chemical scrubbing systems available to the lower ranks. Some captains maintain personal libraries, collections of physical books that are worth a small fortune, in a galaxy where paper is a luxury, and the written word is considered a quasi-sacred medium. Others keep personal armories, displaying the weapons they have collected over careers that might span decades of service across a dozen war zones. The first officer, the master of ordnance, the ship's commissar, the chief navigator, and the other senior officers who form the captain's inner circle each have their own quarters that, while not as grand as the captain's, are still comfortable by any reasonable standard. They sleep in actual beds rather than bunks or hammocks. They eat meals prepared by dedicated staff rather than the communal gruel ladled out in the lower deck mess halls. They have space to move, to think, to be alone, which is a commodity more precious than gold aboard a vessel where privacy is rarer than silence. But for every officer who enjoys these comforts, there are 1,000 crew members who do not. The hierarchy aboard an Imperial battleship is brutally rigid, and the distance between the top and the bottom is measured not just in deck levels, but in quality of life, that might as well belong to different centuries, different worlds, different species. Below the captain and senior officers come the commissioned officers, the lieutenants and sub-lieutenants who manage individual departments and sections of the ship. These are educated men and women. Many of them graduates of naval academies on worlds like Bacca or Hydrofer, trained from youth for service in the Imperial Navy. They understand void warfare, they can read navigational charts, and they know enough about the ship's systems to keep their sections running. Their quarters are modest, but private, small staterooms with a bunk, a desk, a locking cabinet, and their own sanitation facilities. They eat in wardrooms where the food, while not exactly gourmet, is recognizable as food and served on actual plates. Below the commissioned officers come the warrant officers, the backbone of any Imperial warship. These are the experienced voidsmen who have risen through the ranks on the strength of their competence and their ability to keep discipline among the crew. The bosun, the master-at-arms, the gun captains, the senior technicians. All of these positions are typically held by warrant officers who know the ship better than any commissioned officer ever will, because they have lived in its corridors and worked on its systems for years, sometimes decades. Their quarters are smaller, shared in some cases, but still adequate. They are addressed as Sir by the ratings beneath them, and they wield an authority that, in practical day-to-day terms, often exceeds that of the junior officers, because the ratings know that the warrant officers earned their position through demonstrated skill rather than academic credentials. And then we come to the ratings. The ordinary voidsmen and voidswomen who make up the vast bulk of the ship's crew, the people who actually keep the battleship running through the sweat of their brows and the calluses on their hands. These are the ones who crawl through maintenance ducts to repair damaged conduits. The ones who stand watch at sensor stations for 12-hour shifts, staring at green-lit screens until their eyes ache. The ones who load macro cannon shells and haul ammunition carts and scrub deck plates, and operate the thousands of manual systems that a more technologically advanced civilization would have automated long ago, but which the Imperium, in its dogmatic distrust of innovation and its boundless supply of human labor, continues to operate by hand. The living conditions for ordinary ratings vary enormously depending on the ship and the rating's specific role, but a general picture can be painted. A typical rating sleeps in a berthing compartment shared with dozens of other crew members, arranged in tiers of narrow bunks stacked 3 or 4 high. The bunk itself is barely wide enough to lie flat in, curtained off from its neighbors by a thin sheet of fabric that provides the illusion of privacy without the reality of it. Personal storage consists of a small locker bolted to the wall near the bunk, large enough to hold a change of clothing, a few personal items, and whatever devotional materials the rating carries. A chemical toilet is shared between roughly 10 people, and bathing facilities, if they can be called that, typically involve a communal chamber where a chemical cleansing solution is sprayed from overhead nozzles at scheduled intervals. The food is functional. That is the kindest word for it. The ship's kitchens produce enormous quantities of a protein-rich nutrient paste called corpse starch, a name that is unfortunately not entirely metaphorical in some cases, is supplemented by whatever preserved foodstuffs were loaded during the last resupply. Meals are served in vast mess halls where ratings eat in shifts, standing at long metal counters because there are not enough seats for everyone. The taste ranges from bland to actively unpleasant, but it keeps a body alive, and that is all it is designed to do. Clean water is a strictly rationed commodity, allocated by rank, and the lower you are in the hierarchy, the less you receive. Many ratings supplement their water ration by collecting condensation that forms on pipes in the cooler sections of the ship, a practice that is technically against regulations, but universally tolerated, because the alternative would be widespread dehydration. And yet, for all the hardship, many ratings are volunteers. This is a fact that surprises people, but it should not. Life on many Imperial worlds is so grinding, so hopeless, so utterly devoid of opportunity, that the prospect of trading it for a guaranteed bunk, regular meals, and a sense of purpose aboard a warship represents a genuine improvement. The pay is decent by Imperial standards, and a portion of it is sent home to the ratings family if they have one. There is a camaraderie among voidsmen that develops naturally among people who depend on each other for survival in an environment that would kill them all if any single one of them stopped doing their job. And there is pride, genuine pride in being part of something larger than yourself, in knowing that the ship you serve on is a weapon of the Emperor's will, and that your labor, however humble, contributes to the defense of humanity. But not all of the crew came willingly, far from it. Below the ratings, below even the lowest of the volunteer voidsmen, there exists a class of crew member that the official Imperial Navy records refer to with the sanitized term indentured worker, but whom everyone aboard knows by simpler, harsher names: bonded laborers, press-ganged conscripts, slaves. These are the people who occupy the very bottom of the battleship's social hierarchy, and their lives are, to put it plainly, horrific. They were not volunteers. They did not choose to be here. They were taken, snatched from the streets of hive worlds or dragged from penal colonies, or simply born into bondage aboard the ship. Their parents having been press-ganged themselves, condemning their children to the same fate by the simple act of bringing them into existence in this floating iron prison. What the press gang is one of the oldest and most feared traditions of the Imperial Navy. When a battleship needs to replenish its supply of unskilled labor, and it always needs to, because the mortality rate among indentured workers is staggering, the captain has the legal authority to send armed parties down to any Imperial world along the ship's route to conscript new workers. These press gangs are led by armsmen wearing heavy sealed coats and visored helmets, carrying shock mauls and stun weapons, and they descend into the poorest districts of whatever world they visit, like wolves into a sheep pen. They take the homeless, the criminal, the mentally ill, the simply unlucky, anyone who cannot produce documentation proving they serve a vital function in their community, and sometimes even those who can, if the quota has not been filled. Yet the conscripts are brought aboard the ship in chains, processed through intake stations, where they are branded with identification numbers and assigned to work gangs, and then they disappear into the lower decks. Many of them will never see sunlight again. Their duties are the ones that no one else will do. They haul the enormous shells that feed the macro cannons, each shell a massive projectile that requires teams of dozens to maneuver into position using block and tackle systems and crude mechanical hoists. They shovel fuel and clear waste and repair damage in sections of the ship that are too dangerous or too unpleasant for anyone else to enter. They operate the massive manual systems that control the ship's secondary functions, turning flywheels and pulling levers and cranking winches for hours on end in conditions of brutal heat and noise. The work is murderous. That word is chosen deliberately. The life expectancy of an indentured worker assigned to a macro cannon loading gang is measured in weeks. The shells themselves weigh tons, and the loading process involves a precisely choreographed sequence of actions performed under the supervision of a junior tech priest who checks each shell before it is loaded. 3 separate crews work in rotation, one to open the massive breech mechanism using chains and pinions, another to load the shell and align it with the barrel, and a third to clean the breech between firings. Any mistake, any hesitation, any moment of inattention can result in a worker being crushed by a shell that weighs as much as a small vehicle. What the recoil when the cannon fires sends shockwaves through the gun deck that can rupture eardrums and shatter bones. The heat from the discharge mechanism raises the ambient temperature to levels that cause heat stroke and dehydration within hours. And because these guns are the ship's primary weapons, the loading process does not stop for injuries or exhaustion or death. The dead are dragged aside and the living close the gap, and the loading continues. Outside of battle stations, the indentured workers live in conditions that would be considered inhumane even by the standards of the worst hive world slums. They sleep on bare metal pallets in communal barracks, where a single chemical toilet serves 10 people. Their food ration is even less appetizing than what the ratings receive, often consisting of nothing more than a thin gruel supplemented by vitamin supplements that do just enough to keep a body functional. They own nothing. They have no rights. They are considered property of the ship, recorded in the same inventory logs as ammunition stores and replacement parts. Discipline among the indentured workers is maintained through a combination of fear and religious conditioning. The ship's commissars and armsmen patrol the lower decks in force, and punishments for infractions are swift and public. Flogging is common for minor offenses. More serious crimes, theft, fighting, failure to work, are punished by spacing, in which the offender is shoved out of an airlock, or by conversion into a servitor, a fate that many consider worse than death. At the same time, the ship's confessors and preachers work tirelessly among the bonded laborers, reminding them that their suffering is service to the emperor, that their pain has purpose, that the afterlife offers rewards that this life cannot. Whether the workers believe this or simply endure because they have no alternative is a question that the Imperium has never felt the need to ask. And yet, even the indentured workers are not the lowest form of life aboard an Imperial battleship. That distinction belongs to those who dwell in places that no overseer has visited in living memory, But before we descend to those depths, there is something more to be said about the world of the bonded laborer, because the sheer grinding horror of their existence deserves to be understood in full rather than summarized and set aside. Consider the macro cannon itself, yet the weapon that defines the gun deck and the lives of everyone who works there. A single macro cannon battery aboard a battleship can be an edifice half a kilometer long, a building-sized construction of metal and machinery and faith that is covered in gantries and cranes and power cables and pipes, each component maintained by a dedicated crew of hundreds. The shells that feed these weapons are not simply large bullets. They are projectiles the size of small buildings, packed with enough explosive force to level a city block, and they must be moved from the deep magazines to the gun deck and loaded into the breech by human hands, because the Imperium, with its boundless supply of expendable labor and its deep-seated distrust of automation, has never seen fit to mechanize a process that slaves can perform just as well, as at least from the ship's perspective, if not from the slave's perspective. The loading process is a ritual of coordinated suffering. The first crew, typically numbering in the dozens, hauls on chains and operates massive pinion mechanisms to swing open the breech of the gun, a procedure that requires raw physical strength applied in perfect coordination, because a slip at the wrong moment can mean a hand caught in the gears, an arm torn from its socket, a body crushed between moving metal surfaces with no more ceremony than a bug crushed between two fingers. The second crew maneuvers the shell into the loading position, using a combination of block and tackle rigging and sheer muscle to guide a mass that weighs more than most ground vehicles into the precise alignment required for loading. And the third crew is responsible for cleaning the breech between firings, scrubbing away the residue of the previous discharge before the next shell can be loaded, working in conditions of extreme heat and toxic fumes that would require protective equipment in any rational society, but which the Imperium addresses by simply replacing the workers when they become too sick to function. During battle, this process is repeated continuously, as fast as the crews can manage, with overseers standing by with shock whips to punish anyone who slows the pace and tech priests watching each shell with the focused attention of a surgeon monitoring a delicate operation. The sound of a macro cannon battery in full firing rhythm is unlike anything else in human experience. It is a physical force, on a wall of noise that batters the body and the mind with every discharge, accompanied by a recoil that sends tremors through the deck plates, strong enough to crack bone if a person is standing in the wrong position. The heat builds with each firing cycle until the air on the gun deck becomes a shimmering haze that blurs the vision and sears the lungs. Workers collapse from heat stroke and exhaustion, and their bodies are dragged aside by their crewmates so that the loading process can continue without interruption. The mortality rate among macro cannon loading gangs is a statistic that the Imperial Navy records with meticulous precision and addresses with equally meticulous indifference. Workers are lost to crushing injuries, to burns, to toxic exposure, as to the simple exhaustion of bodies pushed beyond their limits by work that never stops and conditions that never improve. The dead are replaced by new conscripts from the next world the ship visits, and the cycle continues. It has continued for 10,000 years. It will continue for 10,000 more, or until the ship itself is finally destroyed, whichever comes first. And yet, even among the bonded laborers, there are hierarchies and gradations of suffering. A laborer assigned to the macro cannon batteries has it bad, but a laborer assigned to the deepest cargo holds, where the air is thin and the gravity plating malfunctions, and the light has not worked in anyone's memory, has it worse. A laborer assigned to waste reclamation, when working in the bowels of the ship, where every organic product of a population, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, is collected and processed and recycled into nutrient paste and breathable air, occupies a level of misery that defeats description. And a laborer assigned to the exterior hull, maintenance teams, suited up in void armor of questionable integrity, and sent outside the ship to repair damage or clear debris, faces the constant possibility of death by vacuum, by radiation, or by the simple failure of equipment that may be older than their grandparents.
Now, I want to take a quick second here to just talk to you directly because this topic genuinely gets to me every time I sit down with it. Out of everything in the 40K universe, the Imperial Navy might be my favorite corner of the lore, and I think it's because it's the most human part of this whole setting. We spend so much time talking about space marines and primarchs and gods, and all of that is incredible, don't get me wrong, but there's something about regular people holding shells in the dark that just hits different. Like, these aren't superhumans, they're just people born on a ship they'll never leave, doing back-breaking work for an empire that doesn't even know their name. And they still find ways to tell jokes and raise kids and fall in love in the middle of all that misery. That's the part of 40K I keep coming back to. But anyways, that's just my take on it. Let's go back to the video.
In the deepest parts of an Imperial battleship, below the gun decks and the cargo holds and the engine rooms, there exist levels that do not appear on any official schematic. They are called the bilge decks, the underholds, the deep places, and they are home to a population that the ship's officers prefer not to think about. These are the forgotten ones, the descendants of crew members who were lost, abandoned, or driven into the ship's lower reaches generations ago. Mutants, many of them, their bodies twisted by generations of exposure to the radiation that leaks from the ship's plasma reactors and warp drive. Their skin might be oddly colored, their limbs strangely proportioned, their eyes adapted to the near-total darkness in which they live. Some bear more dramatic marks of mutation, extra fingers, vestigial tails, bony growths that protrude from their skulls or spines. By the strict letter of Imperial law, most of them would be classified as abhumans at best, and heretical mutants at worst, subject to purging if they were ever brought before the authorities. But they are not brought before the authorities, because the authorities do not venture into the bilge decks. The darkness down there is profound, the corridors narrow and tangled, the air thick with moisture and the stench of organic decay. The bilge dwellers have created their own society in these forgotten spaces, a society with its own leaders and its own customs and its own language, a degraded form of Low Gothic mixed with ship-specific slang that would be largely incomprehensible to someone from the upper decks. They subsist on whatever they can scavenge, vermin, of which there is no shortage aboard a ship that has been sailing for millennia, along with fungi that grow in the damp recesses where condensation pools, and whatever scraps of food or usable material they can steal from the decks above. Their world is one of perpetual darkness, broken only by the bioluminescent fungi that cling to damp walls and the occasional stolen lumen that flickers with failing power. They navigate by touch and by sound, knowing the geography of their domain by the feel of the metal beneath their feet and the echo of their footsteps against the walls around them. Children are raised in this darkness, taught to move silently, to listen for the footsteps of armsmen patrols that occasionally sweep through the upper reaches of their territory, and to hide in spaces so small and so cramped that the idea of an adult human fitting into them would seem absurd to anyone who has not watched it done. The social structure of the bilge communities varies from ship to ship, but certain patterns recur. There is usually a leader, sometimes called a king or a patriarch, or simply the old one, who maintains their authority through a combination of physical prowess, accumulated knowledge, and the respect that accrues to anyone who has survived long enough in these conditions to grow genuinely old. Beneath the leader, a rough hierarchy exists, based on the skills and resources that different individuals and family groups can contribute to the collective survival of the community. Scouts who know the routes to the upper decks, where food and materials can be scavenged, hold positions of importance. Breeders, particularly those who produce children with useful mutations, increased strength, enhanced night vision, and unusual tolerance for radiation, are valued members of the community. Those who possess skills in metalworking or fabric repair, crude though those skills may be by the standards of the upper decks, can leverage their abilities into a degree of status and security. The relationship between the bilge dwellers and the ship's official population is complex and largely unacknowledged. Officially, the bilge dwellers do not exist. The ship's records make no mention of them, and any officer who raised the subject in official channels would likely be told to mind their own business. Unofficially, a symbiosis has developed over the centuries that benefits both sides, though neither would describe it in such polite terms. The bilge dwellers steal from the upper decks, but they also perform services that no one else is willing or able to do. They maintain access to sections of the ship's infrastructure that official maintenance teams cannot reach. They clear vermin infestations in the lower holds. They serve as an informal early warning system for fires, hull breaches, and other emergencies in the deep parts of the ship. And in times of dire need, when the ship is boarded or when battle damage threatens critical systems, they can be pressed into service as emergency labor or even as combatants, fighting with the desperate ferocity of people who have nothing to lose and everything to protect. The ship's hierarchy acknowledges the existence of these populations through a specific officer called the twist catcher. This individual, typically drawn from the armsmen or sometimes the ship's missionary complement, is responsible for keeping the mutant population in check. This does not mean eliminating them, which would be impossible given the vast labyrinthine spaces they inhabit, but rather managing them, ensuring that their numbers do not grow beyond a certain threshold, and that their occasional incursions into the inhabited decks are dealt with swiftly. In times of desperate need, the twist catcher can even press the bilge dwellers into service, herding them up to the gun decks or the boarding defense positions to serve as expendable bodies when the ship's regular crew is not sufficient. The twist catcher is one of the strangest roles aboard any Imperial vessel, part police officer, part diplomat, part hunter, and part social worker. A good twist catcher knows the bilge decks as well as any mutant who lives there. They know the names of the community leaders, the locations of the major settlements, and the unwritten agreements that keep the peace between the underdwellers and the rest of the crew. They know which tunnels are safe to travel and which are claimed by things that are no longer recognizably human, organisms that have mutated so far beyond the baseline that they are essentially new species, blind and pale and hungry, moving through the deepest recesses of the ship like predators in an underground ecosystem that no ecologist ever designed. The bilge dwellers are, in a sense, the ghost population of the battleship. They are the evidence that a vessel this large and this old cannot be fully controlled, that there will always be spaces where the light of authority does not reach, where life finds its own way in conditions that would seem impossible to anyone who has not witnessed them. They are a reminder that an Imperial battleship is not merely a machine, but an ecosystem, and like all ecosystems, it is more complex and more unruly than its designers ever intended, and they are, in their own strange way, proof of humanity's resilience, of the species' ability to survive and adapt and build communities and raise children and find meaning in existence, even in conditions that would seem to deny the very possibility of meaningful life. If the command decks are the brain of a battleship, and the gun decks are its fists, then the enginearium is its beating heart, and the people who work there are arguably the most important souls aboard. The enginearium of a battleship is a region of the ship that defies easy description. It occupies a significant portion of the vessel's total volume, concentrated primarily in the aft sections where the massive plasma reactors and drive systems are housed. But to enter the enginearium is to step into a world dominated by heat, noise, and the presence of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The primary plasma reactors are the ship's power source, and they are monstrous things. Each reactor is a fusion device that generates energy by superheating hydrogen plasma to temperatures that exceed the surface of most stars, containing that plasma within magnetic fields of staggering complexity, and then channeling the resulting energy into the ship's power distribution network. A battleship typically houses multiple reactors, and the engine rooms that surround them are cathedral-like spaces filled with towering machinery, kilometers of cabling and piping, and the constant thunder of processes that generate enough power to light an entire hive city. The heat in the enginearium is brutal. Even with the cooling systems running at full capacity, the ambient temperature in the areas closest to the reactors hovers at levels that would be considered dangerous for prolonged human exposure. The workers who labor here are adapted to it, either through generations of acclimatization or through augmetic modifications that allow their bodies to withstand conditions that would incapacitate an unaugmented human within hours. Many of them wear little clothing, both because fabric becomes unbearable against heat-flushed skin, and because loose clothing is a lethal hazard around the spinning machinery and exposed mechanisms that fill the engine rooms. Their skin is often reddened and leathery, prematurely aged by years of heat exposure. And many bear the scars of steam burns and chemical splashes that are an occupational constant in this environment. The tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus rule the enginearium with an authority that rivals the captain's own. This is their domain, and they defend their prerogatives jealously. The senior tech priest aboard a battleship holds the rank of Tech Priest Majoris, or Engineer Prime, and this individual is responsible for the maintenance and operation of every piece of machinery aboard the vessel, from the plasma reactors to the smallest data cogitator on the bridge. They report directly to the captain, but in matters of technology and maintenance, their word is effectively law. No modification is made to any system without their approval. No repair is undertaken without the proper rituals being observed. No piece of machinery is touched without the appropriate prayers being offered to the Omnissiah, the machine god that the tech priests worship as an aspect of, or perhaps identical to, the emperor of mankind. The maintenance rituals performed by the tech priests are a source of endless fascination and confusion for the unaugmented crew. They involve a bewildering combination of genuine technical procedure and religious ceremony that is impossible to disentangle because the tech priests themselves do not distinguish between the two. Repairing a damaged power conduit might involve replacing the failed component, which is straightforward engineering, but it also involves anointing the new component with sacred oils, chanting a specific sequence of binary prayers that are believed to appease the machine's spirit within, and performing a diagnostic that is phrased as a catechism in which the tech priest asks the machine spirit a series of ritual questions and interprets the readouts as answers. An outside observer might dismiss this as superstition, but the tech priests would point out that their methods have kept these ships running for 10,000 years, which is more than any purely rational approach has managed. The engine workers, the regular human laborers who assist the tech priests, are a specialized caste unto themselves. They are typically recruited from forge worlds or from the families of other engine workers, and they possess a level of technical knowledge that, while far below that of an actual tech priest, is nevertheless impressive by the standards of the average Imperial citizen. They can read pressure gauges and temperature indicators, as they know the warning signs that precede a containment fluctuation, and they understand the basic principles that keep the reactors from becoming the largest bombs in the history of warfare. Their lives are hard, dominated by long shifts in brutal conditions, but they take fierce pride in their work and view themselves as a class apart from the common ratings on the upper decks. Below the plasma reactors, deeper still in the ship's bowels, sits the warp drive. If the plasma reactors are the ship's heart, the warp drive is its wings, the mechanism that allows the vessel to breach the barrier between real space and the immaterium and travel faster than light across interstellar distances. The warp drive is housed in its own dedicated section of the enginearium, heavily shielded and surrounded by layers of psychic wards and protective sigils that have been blessed by representatives of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Access to the warp drive chamber is restricted to the most senior tech priests and the specific maintenance crews who have been screened and sanctioned for proximity to warp-related technology. The reason for this caution is simple. The warp drive does not merely generate energy or propulsion. It tears a hole in reality. It opens a doorway between the physical universe and a dimension of pure psychic energy that is populated by entities whose very existence is antithetical to human life. Working near an active warp drive means working near the membrane between the real and the unreal. And that proximity has effects on the human mind that range from mild unease to complete psychotic collapse, depending on the individual's psychic sensitivity and the current state of warp activity in the region. Even with the drive dormant, the warp drive chamber has an atmosphere that crew members describe as heavy, as if the air itself is slightly wrong in a way that cannot be measured by any instrument, but is absolutely unmistakable to human senses. And then there are the Geller field generators, arguably the most critical technology aboard any warp-capable vessel. Before we discuss the Geller field and the terrors of warp travel, there is another presence aboard the battleship that must be addressed, one that walks its corridors and works at its stations, and yet is barely acknowledged by the living crew who pass them every day. The servitors. They are everywhere. In the enginearium, servitors with arms replaced by welding tools and diagnostic probes tend to machinery under the direction of tech priests, their movements mechanical and repetitive, their eyes vacant, their mouths hanging slightly open in expressions that are not quite alive and not quite dead. On the gun decks, servitors with reinforced skeletal structures and enhanced muscle mass assist with the loading of ammunition, their biological components straining with effort while their faces show nothing at all. On the bridge, servitors plug directly into cogitator stations' process data at speeds that no unaugmented human could match, their fingers twitching over input devices in patterns too fast to follow, their brains reduced to organic computers that serve functions that the Imperium's prohibition on artificial intelligence prevents machines from performing. A servitor is what becomes of a human being when the Adeptus Mechanicus decides that their mind is less useful than their body. The creation of a servitor involves the surgical removal or suppression of higher brain function, the replacement of biological components with cybernetic augmentations tailored to the servitor's intended role, and the programming of whatever remains of the original consciousness to perform a specific set of tasks without deviation or complaint. Many servitors are created from vat-grown organic components, bodies that were never truly alive in any meaningful sense. But many others were once people, as criminals convicted of offenses against the Imperium or the machine cult, heretics whose penance takes the form of having everything that made them a person stripped away and replaced with the cold obedience of a machine. The crew members who work alongside servitors tend to ignore them, the way you might ignore a piece of furniture that happens to move. This is partly a practical response, since servitors are not capable of conversation or social interaction, and there is no benefit to treating them as if they were, and partly a defensive response, since thinking too carefully about what a servitor used to be and what was done to them to make them what they are now is a line of thought that leads nowhere comfortable. Occasionally, a servitor will malfunction, its programming degrading or its organic components failing, and it will exhibit behaviors that suggest some remnant of its original personality is trying to surface. It might speak a word or a phrase that does not relate to its assigned function. It might pause in its work and stare at nothing, as if trying to remember something important. It might weep. When this happens, the tech priests are summoned, the malfunction is corrected, and life goes on. No one talks about it afterward. The servitors are, in their own way, a statement about the Imperium's values. They are proof that the Imperium considers human beings to be a resource, interchangeable and disposable, their value measured entirely by their utility. A criminal who cannot be rehabilitated can still be useful as a servitor. A body that never developed consciousness can still carry shells and turn gears and process data. Nothing is wasted. Everything serves. The Emperor demands no less. Amid the machinery and the hierarchy and the endless cycle of duty, there exists aboard every Imperial battleship something that the official records do not acknowledge, and the officers prefer not to discuss. A thriving underground economy that operates in the spaces between the ship's formal structures. The currency of this economy varies from ship to ship, but it typically centers on commodities that are scarce and desirable: alcohol, tobacco, or its chemical equivalents, stimulant drugs, pornographic material, fresh food, clean water, and the small personal luxuries that make the difference between bare survival and something approaching comfort. These goods circulate through networks of trade and barter that are as complex as any planetary marketplace, managed by individuals who have carved out niches for themselves as middlemen, suppliers, and enforcers in a shadow economy that the ship's commissars know about and tolerate to the precise degree that it contributes to crew morale without threatening discipline. Every battleship has its black marketeers, crew members who have discovered that the skill of acquiring things that other people want and selling them at a profit is just as valuable aboard a warship as it is in any hive city marketplace. Some of them are ratings, who have leverage in the supply chain, working in the kitchens or the stores departments, where they can skim a little off the top of every consignment. Others are armsmen, whose patrol routes give them access to sections of the ship where goods can be stashed and transactions can be conducted away from official eyes. A few are officers who have realized that turning a blind eye to the black market, or even participating in it, gives them a degree of informal power over their subordinates that official authority alone cannot provide. The ship's recreational culture grows up around this economy like vegetation around a water source. Gambling is endemic, ranging from simple dice games played in berthing compartments to elaborate card tournaments that attract participants from across multiple decks and involve stakes that can include months of pay, personal possessions, and in some cases, future labor obligations. Fighting, both organized and spontaneous, is a constant feature of lower deck life, and the ship's armsmen spend almost as much time breaking up brawls as they do conducting security patrols, athletic competitions, arm wrestling tournaments, obstacle courses through maintenance tunnels, endurance challenges that involve running the length of the ship's main corridor in full kit, provide outlets for the competitive energy that accumulates in a population of physically fit young adults with too little space and too much free time. Storytelling is perhaps the most important recreational activity aboard a battleship, and it is one that crosses all social boundaries. In the officers' wardroom, senior staff share accounts of past campaigns and famous engagements over glasses of amasec, each retelling adding new details and embellishments that transform historical events into legend. In the ratings berthing compartments, void-born crew members who have never left the ship trade tales of the worlds they have glimpsed through viewports, the battles they have survived, the friends they have lost, and the rumors they have heard about what lies in the deeper parts of the ship where no one goes. In the lower decks, the bonded laborers tell each other stories about freedom, about planets with open skies and clean water, and the ability to walk in a straight line until you choose to stop. Stories that may be based on real memories or may be entirely imagined, but that serve the same purpose either way. They keep alive the idea that somewhere, somehow, a different kind of life is possible. Music exists aboard the ship in forms that range from the formal hymns sung in the cathedral during worship services to the work songs that gun deck crews chant in rhythm with the loading cycle to the crude, often obscene ballads that ratings compose and perform in the recreation areas during their off-duty hours. The ship's formal musicians, those who play the organs and the bells that accompany religious services, are respected figures who occupy a social niche somewhere between the confessors and the entertainers. The informal musicians, crew members, who have taught themselves to play instruments cobbled together from scrap metal and spare parts, are beloved by their peers in a way that transcends rank and position, because they provide something that the Imperium's rigid hierarchy cannot: moments of pure human joy. These threads of culture and commerce and creativity, unofficial and often technically illegal, are what give the battleship's society its texture and its warmth. Without them, the ship would be nothing more than a machine operated by biological components, efficient but lifeless. With them, it becomes something recognizably human, messy and imperfect, and frequently in violation of regulations, but alive in a way that matters. These devices generate a protective bubble of real space around the ship when it enters the warp, maintaining the physical laws of the universe within a thin shell of normality that keeps the horrors of the Imperium at bay. Without a functioning Geller field, a ship that enters the warp will be torn apart, its crew killed or worse, exposed to the raw stuff of the Imperium and the malevolent intelligences that dwell within it. The maintenance of the Geller field generators is treated with a reverence that goes beyond even the tech priest's usual devotion to their duties. These devices are maintained on a schedule that never deviates, checked and rechecked and triple-checked before every warp transit, and watched over during transit by dedicated teams who stand ready to implement emergency repairs at a moment's notice. The consequences of failure are so catastrophic and so well documented in Imperial records that no one aboard a battleship, from the captain to the lowest bonded laborer, takes the Geller field for granted. Every member of the crew knows at some level that their continued existence depends on these machines continuing to function, and that knowledge colors every warp transit with a low, persistent anxiety that never fully goes away, no matter how many times you make the crossing. No discussion of life aboard an Imperial battleship would be complete without addressing the role of faith, because faith is not merely an aspect of shipboard life, it is the foundation upon which everything else is built. And the Imperial cult permeates every level of the battleship society, from the private chapel where the captain receives communion before a battle to the vast lower deck cathedrals where thousands of crew members gather for compulsory worship services. Every day aboard the ship is structured around a cycle of prayers, hymns, and devotional observances that mark the passage of time and remind every soul aboard that they exist to serve the Emperor and that their suffering, whatever its form, has meaning and purpose within his divine plan. The physical spaces dedicated to worship are among the most impressive on the ship. Imperial battleships typically contain multiple chapels and shrines, but the primary cathedral is a structure that rivals in grandeur anything you might find on a well-established shrine world. Yet the ceiling soars high enough to be lost in shadow, supported by flying buttresses carved from the same adamantium as the ship's hull. The walls are lined with devotional murals depicting scenes from Imperial scripture, the Emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne, the sacrifice of the loyal Primarchs, the defeat of the arch-traitor, and the eternal vigil of mankind against the darkness that presses in from every side. Banks of candles burn perpetually before altars stacked with prayer scrolls and votive offerings, their flickering light casting dancing shadows across the faces of statues that stare down from alcoves with expressions of serene judgment. The ship's confessors and preachers are ubiquitous figures in the daily life of the crew. They lead morning prayers and evening vespers. They deliver sermons during the communal mealtimes, their voices amplified by vox speakers that carry their words to every corner of the mess hall. They move through the berthing compartments and the workstations and the gun decks, offering blessings and admonitions and the occasional threat of damnation to anyone whose devotion appears to be flagging. They are counselors, enforcers, and entertainers all at once, and their influence over the lower deck crew is immense. For many crew members, especially those in the lower ranks, faith is not merely a comfort, but a necessity. The conditions they live and work in are harsh enough that some form of psychological support is essential to prevent widespread despair, and the Imperial cult provides that support with ruthless efficiency. And it tells the exhausted rating-hauling macro cannon shells that his labor is holy, that the Emperor sees his suffering and values it, that every blister on his hands is a prayer made flesh. It tells the bonded laborer who has never seen the sky that the universe outside the ship's hull is a place of unimaginable danger, and that the metal walls that confine him also protect him, that the ship is an extension of the Emperor's own body, and that to serve it is to serve him directly. It tells the frightened child born in the lower decks that she is part of something vast and eternal and worth believing in, even when everything she can see and hear and smell suggests otherwise. Whether this constitutes comfort or control depends on your perspective, and the Imperium has never been particularly interested in exploring that distinction. Or what matters is that it works. The Imperial cult keeps 1,000,000 souls functioning in conditions that would otherwise breed despair and rebellion, and that is enough. But the religious life of the ship extends beyond the formal structures of the Imperial cult. The Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests maintain their own shrines and observances, dedicated to the Omnissiah, and their binary hymns can be heard echoing through the enginearium at all hours of the day and night cycle. The ship's navigators, those rare and invaluable mutants who guide the vessel through the warp, maintain private chapels within their sealed quarters that no outsider is permitted to enter. Even among the common crew, informal religious practices flourish. Small shrines tucked into corners of berthing compartments, lucky charms made from spent bolt casings or fragments of blessed ceramite, whispered prayers to local saints whose names are known only aboard this particular vessel and whose legends have grown and changed with each retelling until they bear only the faintest resemblance to whatever historical figure may have originally inspired them. Faith is the air that the ship breathes, the oil that keeps its social machinery running, and the chain that binds its 1,000,000 disparate souls into something resembling a functional community. Without it, the battleship would tear itself apart, not from any external enemy, but from the simple, crushing weight of what it means to be a human being living in a metal box in the darkness between the stars. The confessors themselves deserve particular attention, because they occupy a role aboard the battleship that is equal parts spiritual guide, political officer, and community organizer. A good confessor knows the names and faces of the crew in their section. They know who is struggling with personal demons and who is on the verge of a breakdown. They know which families are feuding and which friendships are fraying under the strain of shipboard life. They are, in many ways, the closest thing to a social safety net that the lower deck crew possesses. And the best among them take this responsibility seriously, spending their days walking among the people they serve, listening to their concerns, arbitrating their disputes, and performing the small, quiet acts of pastoral care that keep individuals from falling through the cracks of the ship's rigid social structure. Most the darker side of this role is that the confessors also serve as intelligence gatherers for the ship's commissariat. The confessional is sacred, and theoretically, anything said within it is protected by the seal of religious confidence. In practice, a confessor who hears a crew member express treasonous thoughts or heretical beliefs is expected to report this information to the commissar, and most confessors do so without hesitation, because they believe, genuinely and fervently, that protecting a soul from the taint of heresy is more important than protecting their temporal confidence. This dual role makes the confessors simultaneously the most trusted and the most feared figures in the lower deck community, a source of comfort and a source of danger, while navigating this contradiction is one of the unspoken skills that every crew member must develop if they want to survive aboard an Imperial warship. The religious calendar of the ship provides a framework of observances that punctuates the monotony of daily life and gives the crew something to look forward to beyond the next meal and the next sleep cycle. Saints' days are celebrated with special services, additional food rations, and in some cases, a cessation of non-essential work that gives the crew a rare opportunity for genuine rest. The Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, the holiest day in the Imperial calendar, and is marked with ceremonies of such elaborate grandeur that the entire ship pauses in its operations for several hours while the cathedral fills to overflowing and the sound of 1,000 voices raised in hymn echoes through corridors that are, for once, empty of their usual bustle. Death has its own rituals aboard the ship, rituals that are performed with a frequency that reflects the constant attrition of life in the void. The dead are cremated in the ship's reclamation furnaces, their ashes collected in small urns that are either stored in the ship's memorial vault or, if the family requests it, scattered from an airlock into the void. A brief service is conducted by the section confessor, attended by the deceased's work crew and whatever friends or family members can be spared from their duties. The service follows a standard format. a reading from the Imperial scriptures, a prayer for the soul's safe passage to the Emperor's side, and a final benediction that releases the deceased from their obligations to the ship and commends them to the eternal vigil of the God Emperor. For the bereaved, grief is a luxury that the ship's schedule does not accommodate. A mourning period of 24 hours is considered standard, during which the deceased's work shifts are covered by their crewmates, and then the survivor is expected to return to their duties as if nothing has happened. The confessor may offer additional counseling if the bereavement is particularly severe, but the prevailing attitude aboard an Imperial warship is that death is a constant companion, that mourning must not interfere with function, and that the best way to honor the dead is to continue the work that they can no longer perform. The daily routine aboard an Imperial battleship is governed by a cycle of watches that divides the ship's artificial day into segments of activity and rest. Since there is no natural daylight to mark the passage of time, the ship's lumens follow a programmed cycle that brightens and dims in simulation of a planetary day, though the specific length of that cycle varies from ship to ship and may not correspond to any actual planetary rotation period. Some vessels run on a standard Terran cycle. Others have adopted the day length of whatever world their captain or crew originally hailed from. A few particularly ancient vessels run on cycles that no one aboard can explain or trace to any known world, are artifacts of a time so long ago that even the reason for the schedule has been forgotten. A typical crew member's day begins with the brightening of the lumens in their berthing compartment, and the sound of a bosun's whistle piped through the Vox speakers, accompanied by a prayer of awakening that is the same every morning and has been the same for as long as anyone can remember. The crew rolls out of their bunks, stows their bedding, and queues for the sanitation facilities with the resigned patience of people who have done this same thing every day of their lives. Morning ablutions are brief and perfunctory, involving a chemical cleansing process that takes perhaps 2 minutes and leaves the skin dry and faintly tingling. Clean clothes are distributed from communal stores, and since individual laundry facilities do not exist below officer country, breakfast is taken in the mess hall, where enormous vats of nutrient paste have been prepared by the ship's kitchen staff during the preceding hours. The paste is ladled into metal bowls, supplemented on good days by a portion of reconstituted protein supplement that approximates the texture and flavor of meat in the same way that a painted backdrop approximates a landscape. A beverage is served that the crew calls recaf, a stimulant drink brewed from a substance that is at least distantly related to caffeine, though its exact composition would require a tech priest to analyze, and no one has ever seen fit to do so. The meal is eaten quickly and in near silence, and since talking during the meal period is discouraged by the overseers who patrol the mess halls looking for signs of idleness or discontent. After breakfast, the duty watch begins. For ratings assigned to maintenance duties, this means descending into the ship's innards to inspect, repair, and maintain the thousands of systems that keep the vessel functioning. For gundeck crews, it means drilling, because the macro cannons and lance batteries must be ready to fire at a moment's notice, and the loading and aiming procedures are drilled and re-drilled until they can be performed in darkness, in smoke, in the chaos of a hull breach, without conscious thought. For the armsmen who serve as the ship's internal security force, the watch means patrolling corridors and checkpoints, maintaining order among the lower deck populations, and standing ready to respond to any incident, from a bar fight in a crew recreation area to a full-scale mutiny in the bonded labor compartments. Work shifts typically last between 8 and 12 hours, depending on the captain's standing orders and the ship's current operational status. During peacetime cruising, the pace is steady but manageable, with crew members rotating through duty stations in a pattern that ensures every critical system is continuously manned, while allowing enough rest to prevent the kind of exhaustion-induced errors that can prove fatal aboard a warship. During combat operations, the watches extend and the rest periods shrink, sometimes to nothing, as every available hand is called to their battle station. and the entire ship shifts into a mode of sustained emergency that can last for hours or days or, in the worst cases, weeks. Between watches, crew members have a few precious hours of free time that they fill in whatever ways are available to them. The ship's recreation facilities are limited but real. Some vessels maintain communal areas where ratings can gather to talk, to play simple games of chance or skill, to listen to recorded music piped through tinny speakers, or simply to sit in a space that is slightly larger and slightly quieter than their berthing compartments. Physical training is encouraged, and many ships maintain exercise spaces where crew members can run or spar or lift weights, both to maintain their fitness and to burn off the restless energy that accumulates in people who spend their lives in enclosed spaces with limited freedom of movement. Alcohol exists aboard Imperial battleships, though its distribution is carefully controlled. Officially sanctioned rations of a low-grade spirit called amasec are distributed to ratings at regular intervals, usually once per week, and unofficial distilleries operated by enterprising crew members produce a variety of home-brewed spirits of varying quality and legality. The ship's commissars and armsmen tolerate this underground economy to a degree, recognizing that a crew with a moderate alcohol supply is easier to manage than one without it. But anyone caught running a still that produces enough volume to cause widespread discipline problems will find themselves facing punishments that make flogging look merciful. The off-duty hours are also when the ship's informal social life comes most alive. Relationships form, both platonic and romantic, among people who spend their lives in such close proximity that the usual social barriers become meaningless. Marriages are recognized by the ship's confessors, children are born in the medical wards, and families grow up in the berthing compartments, adding their voices to the constant murmur of human life that fills the ship like blood fills veins. There are disputes and feuds and alliances and betrayals, all the drama of human existence compressed into the narrow confines of a metal world that offers no escape and no privacy and no possibility of ever truly getting away from the people around you. This is what daily life looks like for the bulk of a battleship's population. It is repetitive and exhausting and sometimes brutally hard, but it is also, in its own way, a life. People find meaning in it. They find connection. And they find moments of grace amid the grind, a shared laugh in the mess hall, a moment of beauty when the lumens dim and the ship's chapel fills with the sound of a hymn sung by 1,000 voices, a quiet conversation with a friend during the night watch when the corridors are empty and the ship feels, for a brief moment, almost peaceful. These small human moments are what make the existence bearable, and they are, in the end, what makes a battleship more than just a machine. They are what make it a home. The medical facilities aboard an Imperial battleship occupy a section of the ship that exists in a state of permanent, understaffed crisis. The ship's surgeon, sometimes called the chief chirurgeon, oversees a network of sick bays, operating theatres, and quarantine wards that are responsible for the health of a population that can number in the hundreds of thousands. And they accomplish this with resources that a planetary hospital administrator would consider criminally inadequate. The main medici ward is located on the mid-decks, roughly equidistant from the command section and the lower working levels, positioned for maximum accessibility from the areas where injuries are most likely to occur. It is a long, low-ceilinged space filled with rows of metal cots, each one separated from its neighbors by curtains that provide a thin veil of privacy for patients who may be recovering from injuries that range from minor burns and broken bones to amputations, radiation exposure, and the psychological trauma that accompanies prolonged void service. The smell is a distinctive combination of antiseptic chemicals, the metallic tang of surgical instruments, and the organic undertone of human bodies in various states of distress, a smell that the Medicae staff stop noticing after their first week on the job, but that visitors never quite get used to. The ship's surgeon is typically a figure of considerable importance aboard the vessel, respected by the crew in a way that transcends their official rank. This is because the surgeon is one of the few people aboard who treats every patient the same, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. A bonded laborer with a crushed hand receives the same medical attention as a lieutenant with a fractured wrist, at least in theory, because the surgeon's primary obligation is to maintain the crew's combat effectiveness, and every pair of working hands matters. In practice, of course, the officers receive better care in better facilities with better supplies, because the hierarchy never truly stops, even in the medici ward. But the principle of equality in suffering is important, and it gives the surgeon a moral authority that few other figures aboard the ship can match. The diseases that afflict the crew of a battleship are as varied as the conditions they live in. Upper respiratory infections spread rapidly through the crowded berthing compartments, where the recycled air carries pathogens from one end of the deck to the other with the efficiency of a purpose-designed delivery system. Skin conditions, ranging from fungal infections bred in the warm, damp lower decks to the radiation burns that plague engine workers, are a constant presence in the medici ward. Malnutrition, despite the availability of nutrient paste, is common among the bonded laborers and the bilge dwellers, whose access to even the basic food supply is uncertain, and the psychological conditions, the nightmares and the paranoia and the depression and the dissociative episodes that are the inevitable product of life in an enclosed metal environment with no access to sunlight, fresh air, or open space, are endemic and largely untreated, because the Imperial approach to mental health is to prescribe prayer and discipline and consider the matter closed. Children are born aboard Imperial battleships with a regularity that might surprise anyone who has not considered the demographics of a population numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Where there are people, there will be families, and where there are families, there will be children, and the ship must accommodate them because they represent the next generation of crew members who will keep the vessel running after their parents are gone. The experience of growing up aboard a battleship is unlike childhood anywhere else in the galaxy. A void-born child takes their first steps on metal deck plates, learns to talk amid the constant background hum of machinery, and develops a spatial awareness that is uniquely adapted to the three-dimensional environment of a ship's interior. They learn to navigate by the sound and feel of the vessel around them, recognizing which deck they are on by the pitch of the engine vibration beneath their feet, which section they are in by the quality of the air and the temperature of the walls. They learn the ship's rhythms. It's the brightening of the lumens that signals morning, the distant thunder of the guns during firing drills, the subtle change in the vibration that means the warp drive is being spooled up for transit. Education aboard a battleship is functional rather than academic. The ship's confessors teach the children to read and write in Low Gothic, to recite the basic catechisms of the Imperial cult, and to understand their place in the Emperor's divine order. Beyond these basics, education is vocational, with children being directed toward the skills that the ship needs. The child of a macro cannon loader will learn the loading drills. The child of a voidsman will learn conduit maintenance and bulkhead repair. The child of an engine worker will learn to read pressure gauges and recognize the warning signs of containment fluctuation. But the idea that a child might choose their own profession, might dream of being something other than what their parents were, is a luxury that the ship's social structure does not accommodate, and that its inhabitants, for the most part, do not expect. And yet, children remain children, even in the belly of a battleship. They play in the corridors when the overseers are not watching, chasing each other through maintenance tunnels and climbing the ladderways and sliding down the smooth surfaces of access ramps. They invent games using whatever materials are available, turning spent bolt casings into game pieces and scratching playboards onto deck plates with sharpened scraps of metal. They form friendships that will last a lifetime, to bonds forged in shared experience that are as strong as any that develop among children anywhere in the galaxy. And they dream, as all children dream, of futures that may or may not be possible, but that sustain them through the long, monotonous days of their ship-bound childhood. The Voidborn as a whole, adults and children alike, share certain characteristics that distinguish them from planet-born humans. They tend to be tall and thin, their bodies adapted to the slightly irregular gravity fields generated by the ship's grav plates. Their skin is pale from lack of exposure to natural sunlight, and their eyes are often unusually large, an adaptation to the dim lighting of the lower decks. They are comfortable in enclosed spaces that would give a planet-born person claustrophobia, and conversely, they are often deeply unsettled by open skies and natural landscapes on the rare occasions when they set foot on a planetary surface. Some Voidborn never leave the ship at all, living their entire lives from birth to death within the metal walls that define their world, and they consider this not a hardship, but simply the natural order of things. The void between stars is not merely empty, it is hostile in ways that are difficult for a planet-bound mind to fully appreciate, and the dangers faced by an Imperial battleship during its voyages are as varied as they are lethal. Begin with the simple physical reality of deep space. The temperature outside the ship's hull is mere fractions of a degree above absolute zero, cold enough to freeze flesh solid in seconds and to make metal as brittle as glass. The vacuum itself would kill an unprotected human in minutes, the air in their lungs expanding and rupturing tissue, the moisture in their eyes and skin boiling away into nothing. Radiation from nearby stars and from the background cosmic flux bombards the hull continuously, held at bay by the ship's shielding but never entirely eliminated, contributing to the elevated rates of mutation and cancer that are a fact of life for anyone who spends extended periods in the void. Micrometeorites and space debris strike the hull with impacts that range from insignificant pings to catastrophic breaches, and the ship's sensor arrays and defensive turrets work constantly to detect and neutralize the larger threats before they can do serious damage. But these are merely the mundane dangers, or the ones that any spacefaring civilization must contend with. The Imperium of man faces threats that go far beyond the merely physical. The warp is the greatest of these. Every time an Imperial battleship makes the transition from real space into the immersive for faster-than-light travel, it is undertaking an act that is, in a very real sense, suicidal. The warp is not simply an alternate dimension or a convenient shortcut through the fabric of space. It is a roiling ocean of psychic energy populated by sentient malevolences that hunger for human souls with a need that is beyond mortal comprehension. It is the realm of demons, of the ruinous powers, of entities whose very existence is sustained by the suffering and corruption of mortal beings. To enter the warp is to plunge into hell and pray that you emerge on the other side before something notices you. The Geller field protects the ship during transit, surrounding it with a bubble of real space that keeps the laws of physics intact and the demons at bay. But the Geller field is not infallible. It can weaken. It can fluctuate. It can, in the worst cases, fail entirely. And when it does, the results are catastrophic beyond description. People disappear. Crew members go mad, turning on each other in frenzies of violence that have no rational cause. Things appear in corridors that should not exist, entities of shadow and malice that feed on fear and pain and leave only silence behind them. Entire sections of the ship might become tainted, with the walls themselves seeming to breathe and pulse as the boundary between reality and the immaterium grows thin. Even with the Geller field functioning perfectly, warp transit takes a toll on the crew. The warp has a way of seeping through even the strongest protections, manifesting not as physical intrusions, but as psychological effects that accumulate over repeated transits. Nightmares are universal among warp travelers, dreams of such vivid horror that they linger for days after waking. Mood disturbances, paranoia, irrational anger, sudden bouts of crippling depression, all of these are common enough that the ship's confessors maintain dedicated counseling protocols for crew members who have been through particularly rough transits. In extreme cases, prolonged warp exposure can trigger latent psychic abilities in individuals who had no previous indication of such potential, which is a catastrophe rather than a gift, since an unsanctioned psyker aboard a sealed vessel is a beacon for exactly the kind of warp entities that the Geller field is designed to keep out. The navigator who guides the ship through the warp is one of the most important individuals aboard, and also one of the most isolated. Navigators are a distinct subspecies of humanity, bred over thousands of generations for the specific purpose of perceiving the warp with their third eye, a literal additional organ located in the center of their forehead, and using that perception to chart a course through the Immerterium's ever-shifting currents. They are members of the Navis Nobilitae, as powerful noble houses based on terror that have maintained their bloodlines through careful intermarriage for millennia, and they are treated with a deference that borders on reverence by the ship's crew. The navigator's quarters aboard a battleship are a sealed enclave, separate from the rest of the ship and accessible only through locked passages that even the captain cannot open without the navigator's consent. This isolation is not mere aristocratic preference, it is a practical necessity. A navigator in the process of guiding a ship through the warp is in a state of psychic communion with the Immerterium that makes them dangerous to be around. Their third eye is open, perceiving realities that would drive an ordinary human to instant madness, and the psychic emanations they produce during this process can cause headaches, nausea, and hallucinations in anyone who comes too close. The Astronomicon, that great psychic beacon generated on Terra by the sacrifice of thousands of psychers who feed their life force into the Emperor's golden throne, is what the navigator follows through the warp. It is the lighthouse in the storm, the fixed point of reference in a dimension where nothing else is fixed. Without it, warp navigation would be an act of pure gambling, a blind leap into an infinite darkness with no guarantee of emerging anywhere close to your intended destination. The Astronomicon is, in a very real sense, what holds the Imperium together. Without it, the scattered worlds of humanity would be isolated islands in a sea of madness, unable to communicate, unable to trade, unable to reinforce each other against the endless threats that press in from every direction. And yet, even with the Astronomicon to guide them and the Gellerfield to protect them, warp transit remains fundamentally unpredictable. Time does not flow at a consistent rate within the Immerterium. A journey that takes 3 weeks in warp time might correspond to 3 months in real space, or 3 days, or 3 years. Ships have emerged from the warp to discover that centuries have passed since their departure, their crew now orphans of time, everything they knew swept away by the relentless march of years they never experienced. Others have arrived at their destination before they left, creating temporal paradoxes that the Imperium's administrators prefer to resolve by simply pretending they never happened. Beyond the warp, there are enemies that threaten the ship in real space as well. Pirate fleets, both human and alien, prowl the shipping lanes. Orc raiding parties fall upon Imperial vessels with the gleeful savagery of a species that exists to fight and finds joy in nothing else. Their ramshackle but terrifyingly effective warships close to boarding range with reckless abandon, their hulls disgorging swarms of howling green-skinned warriors who pour through breached airlocks with weapons drawn and teeth bared, seeking nothing but the thrill of battle and the satisfaction of destruction. Eldar raiders, elegant and cruel, strike from the hidden highways of the webway with surgical precision, taking what they want and vanishing before the battleship's guns can be brought to bear. And the forces of chaos, traitor fleets crewed by heretics and madmen, and things that were once human but are no longer, unemerge from the warp itself to prey upon loyal Imperial shipping with a hatred that has festered for 10,000 years. When battle comes, the transformation that sweeps through the battleship is absolute. The ship goes from a creaking, groaning habitat to a weapon of war in the span of minutes, as alarm klaxons wail through every corridor and every soul aboard rushes to their assigned station with the desperate urgency of people who know that their survival depends on every gun being manned and every system being operational when the first shots are fired. Battle aboard an Imperial battleship is an experience that those who survive it carry with them for the rest of their lives, and it is nothing like what the propaganda posters and the recruitment orators describe. The first warning comes through the Vox system, and a klaxon followed by the calm, clipped voice of the officer of the watch, announcing that the ship is moving to battle stations. This announcement, heard throughout the vessel, triggers a cascade of activity that has been drilled into every crew member so many times that it is practically automatic. Ratings drop whatever they are doing, grab their void suits and helmets from the racks mounted near every hatchway, and begin moving at a controlled run toward their assigned positions. Armsmen take up defensive positions at key intersections, their shotguns loaded, and their faces set in expressions of grim readiness. The tech priests in the enginearium begin the ritual prayers for battle, chanting in binary, while their servitors run final diagnostics on every critical system. On the bridge, on the Sasamation, the captain settles into the command throne and begins issuing orders to the helmsman, the master of ordnance, and the signals officer, their voices crisp and professional in the practiced choreography of void warfare. In the gun decks, the transformation is visceral. The massive blast doors that seal the macro cannon batteries during peacetime grind open, revealing the enormous weapons in their cradles, and the loading gangs begin the process of preparing them to fire. The shells are brought up from the magazines on enormous mechanical lifts, each one requiring a team of workers to maneuver it into the loading position. The air fills with the sound of chains rattling and gears grinding and overseers shouting and the low or rhythmic chanting of the gun crews who have turned the loading process into a work song that helps them maintain the pace required to keep the batteries firing at combat speed. When the guns fire, the experience is shattering in the most literal sense. The recoil of a macro cannon battery sends a shockwave through the gun deck that can knock a man off his feet if he is not braced for it. The noise is beyond deafening, a physical force that compresses the chest and makes the vision blur. The concussive blast vents are supposed to channel the worst of the pressure away from the crew, but they are never entirely effective, and the gun deck workers operate in a state of continuous acoustic assault that leaves many of them partially or completely deaf after a few years of service. Now, the heat from the discharge mechanisms raises the temperature on the gun deck to levels that would be considered dangerous in any other context, and the combination of heat, noise, physical exertion, and the knowledge that you are sitting on top of a magazine full of enough ammunition to vaporize the entire section of the ship, if something goes wrong, creates a psychological burden that breaks some people and forges others into something harder than the metal around them. On the bridge, the battle unfolds on hololithic displays that show the positions of friendly and enemy vessels as glowing points of light in a three-dimensional tactical plot. The captain issues orders through the Vox, directing the helmsman to bring the ship's broadside to bear on the enemy, ordering the master of ordnance to fire at will, calling for the launch bays to deploy fighter and bomber squadrons. The bridge is quieter than the gun decks, but the tension is no less intense. Every officer knows that a single mistake, a misread sensor contact, a poorly timed course change, a failure to react quickly enough to an enemy maneuver, could result in the death of everyone aboard. The shields are the ship's first line of defense. Void shields, those massive energy fields that envelop the vessel in a protective barrier capable of absorbing tremendous amounts of incoming fire, are what stand between the crew and oblivion during the opening stages of any engagement. Each shield layer can only absorb so much punishment before it collapses, forcing the generators to cycle and recharge before the shield can be restored. The crew can feel when a shield layer goes down, not as a specific sensation, but as a subtle change in the ambient vibration of the ship, a faint shudder that runs through the deck plates and up through the soles of their boots. Experienced voidsmen can count the shield layers by these vibrations, and they know that when the last shield falls, the ship's hull is all that stands between them and the enemy's guns. Hull breaches are the terror of void warfare. When an enemy shell or torpedo penetrates the hull, the result is an explosive decompression that can suck everything not bolted down, including human beings. out through the hole and into the vacuum of space. Emergency bulkheads slam shut automatically to contain the breach, sealing off the affected section. But anyone on the wrong side of those bulkheads when they close is simply lost. Air damage control teams rush to the breach with welding equipment and emergency patches, working in void suits in conditions of near-zero gravity and total vacuum to seal the hole before the ship loses too much atmosphere. Meanwhile, on the other side of the sealed bulkheads, crew members who were in the affected section when it was breached bang on the metal doors and scream into their vox sets, begging to be rescued, knowing that the bulkheads will not be opened until the breach is sealed, and knowing that their air is running out. Fires are perhaps even more feared than hull breaches, because fire aboard a sealed vessel has nowhere to go and no natural way to be extinguished. The oxygen-rich atmosphere of the ship feeds the flames, and the materials that line the corridors, while nominally fire-resistant, will burn fiercely once ignited. Our fire control teams are among the most heavily trained and equipped aboard the ship, and they attack blazes with a ferocity born of the knowledge that an uncontrolled fire can kill more people than an enemy broadside. The ship's fire suppression systems, which work by sealing off the affected section and venting its atmosphere into the void, are effective but brutal, since anyone trapped in a section that is being vented will suffocate along with the fire. And then there is boarding. When enemy forces breach the hull with boarding torpedoes or assault boats, or, in the case of certain alien species, by simply tearing through the ship's armor with biological or technological means, the result is close-quarters combat of a savagery that makes ground warfare look civilized by comparison. The ship's armsmen, and any ratings who can be armed, are thrown into the fighting, defending their vessel corridor by corridor, junction by junction, in a desperate struggle where the advantage shifts constantly, and the margin between victory and annihilation is measured in meters and minutes. The ship's internal defenses, blast doors, automated gun emplacements, even sections that can be deliberately depressurized to kill boarders, are deployed without hesitation, and the casualties on both sides are enormous. For the crew, a boarding action is the most terrifying thing that can happen. It means the enemy is inside your home, inside the walls that were supposed to protect you, and there is nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The corridors become killing grounds, the junctions become ambush points, and the familiar geography of your daily life becomes a battlefield where death waits around every corner. The sounds of a boarding action, the crash of breaching charges, the shriek of tortured metal, the crack of last fire, and the boom of shotguns and the screaming, the constant screaming, are sounds that haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. When a boarding action ends, whether in victory or in the enemy being driven back to their own ship, the aftermath is something that the Imperial Navy's recruitment materials never mention. The corridors where the fighting took place are littered with debris and bodies, the air thick with the smell of blood and burning, and the chemical residue of weapons discharge. Damage control teams move through the affected sections, sealing breaches and restoring atmosphere, while Medicae teams follow behind them, triaging the wounded and collecting the dead. The chaplains move through the corridors too, administering last rites to the dying and leading the survivors in prayers of thanksgiving for their deliverance. The psychological toll of a boarding action falls heaviest on the ratings and the bonded laborers, the people who were never trained for close combat but who found themselves fighting for their lives in the corridors of the only home they have ever known. These are the people who will flinch at loud noises for months afterward, who will wake screaming from nightmares about alien faces and the sound of metal tearing, who will never again feel entirely safe in the corridors where they were once attacked. The ship's confessors do their best to minister to these wounded souls, leading group prayers and individual counseling sessions that attempt to frame the trauma within the context of the Imperial cult's teachings about sacrifice and service. Some crew members recover, some do not. Some carry their wounds silently until the weight of them becomes unbearable, and then they are found in some quiet corner of the ship where they went to be alone, and the Medicae team, adds another name to the casualty list, and life goes on. The repairs that follow a major engagement can take weeks or months, depending on the extent of the damage and the availability of replacement materials. During this period, the ship limps toward the nearest friendly port, its crew working around the clock to restore functionality to damaged systems, seal hull breaches with temporary patches, and maintain the minimum level of operational readiness required to survive another encounter. It is a period of intense labor and constant anxiety, because a wounded ship is a vulnerable ship, and the enemies of the Imperium are always watching for weakness. When the ship finally reaches port, whether an orbital dock above a forge world or a naval station in some fortified system, the relief that sweeps through the crew is palpable. Dockside repair crews swarm over the hull, patching and replacing and restoring, while the ship's own crew takes advantage of the respite to rest, to replenish supplies, and in some cases, to set foot on solid ground for the first time in months or years. Shore leave is granted to those who have earned it, though the definition of earned varies enormously depending on the captain's disposition and the ship's current needs. For many ratings, shore leave is the closest thing to freedom they will ever experience. A few hours or days in which they can walk under an open sky, eat food that does not come from a recycler, and pretend for a brief, precious moment that they are something other than components of a floating war machine. And then the ship sails again. The repairs are completed, the stores are replenished, the crew is mustered, and the engines roar to life, and the battleship moves out of dock and into the void, heading for whatever war or patrol or mission the Sector Admiralty has assigned it. The cycle begins anew. The watches resume. The prayers are said. The guns are drilled. And the million souls aboard the vessel settle back into the rhythms of shipboard life, because there is nothing else to do, and nowhere else to go, and no one is coming to offer them a different life. The Astropaths aboard an Imperial battleship are among its most vital and most tragic crew members, occupying a role that is essential to the Imperium's survival, but that comes at a personal cost that few outside their order fully appreciate. Astropaths are psychers, human beings born with the ability to tap into the psychic energy of the warp and use it for various purposes. In their case, that purpose is communication. Astropaths can send and receive psychic messages across interstellar distances, transmitting information through the warp in a manner that, while imprecise and subject to interference, is the only method of faster-than-light communication available to the Imperium. Without astropathic communication, the Imperium would be blind and deaf, unable to coordinate its military forces, unable to transmit intelligence about enemy movements, unable to maintain the administrative connections that hold its million worlds together. The price of this ability is steep. Every astropath has undergone a process called soul binding, in which they are brought before the Emperor himself on Terra, and their psychic essence is fused with a fraction of his immense psychic power. This process strengthens the astropath's abilities and provides them with a degree of protection against the warp entities that are drawn to psychic activity, like predators, to blood in the water. But the soul binding also burns out the astropath's physical eyes, or leaving them permanently blind. They perceive the world around them through a combination of psychic sensitivity and heightened non-visual senses, but they can never again see the faces of the people they work alongside, or the stars that shine outside the viewports they will never look through. Aboard the battleship, the astropaths are housed in a section of the ship called the Astropathic Choir, a specially constructed chamber that is shielded against psychic interference and designed to amplify the astropath's abilities. Multiple astropaths typically serve aboard a battleship, working in rotation to maintain a continuous communication capability. Their work is exhausting and dangerous, since every psychic transmission involves opening their mind to the warp and projecting their thoughts through a medium that is actively hostile to human consciousness. The strain of this process ages astropaths prematurely, and many succumb to madness, possession, or simple psychic burnout after years of service. The regular crew gives the Astropaths a wide berth, treating them with a mixture of respect and unease that is common throughout the Imperium in dealings with psychers. They are necessary, everyone acknowledges that, but they are also touched by the warp, and that touch makes people nervous. The Astropaths, for their part, tend to keep to themselves, forming their own small community within the larger society of the ship, and a community bound together by shared suffering and the knowledge that they are feared as much as they are valued. The spectre of mutiny hangs over every Imperial battleship like a shadow that never quite lifts. When you confine hundreds of thousands of human beings in a metal box, subject them to harsh conditions and rigid discipline, and deny them any meaningful control over their own lives, the possibility of rebellion is not a distant theoretical concern. It is an ever-present reality that the ship's officers and commissars must constantly work to prevent. The naval commissar is a figure who inspires more fear than any enemy combatant, because the enemy can only kill you once, while the commissar can make your death an object lesson that echoes through the ship for years. Commissars are officers of the Officio Prefectus. Yes, an organization that exists solely to maintain loyalty and discipline within the Imperial military. They have the authority to execute any crew member, up to and including the ship's captain, if they determine that the individual is displaying cowardice, disloyalty, or any other behavior that threatens the ship's combat effectiveness. This authority is not theoretical. Commissars use it. Stories of summary executions on the bridge, of officers shot mid-sentence for suggesting retreat, of entire work gangs decimated for failing to meet production quotas during battle, are part of the oral history of every Imperial warship, and they serve their intended purpose. They make people afraid, and afraid people obey. The commissar walks the ship's corridors like a wolf among sheep, their distinctive uniform, the greatcoat and the peaked cap and the bolt pistol worn openly on the hip, immediately recognizable to every crew member who sees them coming, and immediately triggering the instinct to look busy, look loyal, look like someone who has nothing to hide. The commissar's gaze is an audit, a searching examination that measures every face it falls upon against an internal standard of proper Imperial devotion, and finds most of them wanting. A commissar does not need evidence to act. Suspicion is sufficient. The merest hint that a crew member's loyalty might be wavering, a careless word overheard by an informant, a failure to attend a mandatory worship service, a reluctance to volunteer for a particularly dangerous duty, can result in consequences that range from a formal reprimand to a public execution, all depending on the commissar's assessment of the situation and their personal inclination toward mercy or severity. But the commissar alone cannot prevent mutiny. The conditions that breed rebellion, the exhaustion, the hunger, the constant danger, the feeling of being trapped in a system that views you as expendable, are too deeply rooted to be addressed by fear alone. The ship's officers must balance discipline with a degree of pragmatic leniency, granting small freedoms and tolerating minor infractions in order to maintain the overall stability of the crew. A wise captain knows that a rating who is allowed to gamble during off-duty hours and drink a modest ration of spirits once a week is a rating who is less likely to start sharpening a knife and whispering sedition to their bunkmates. And a foolish captain who cracks down on every petty infraction and demands perfect obedience at all times will eventually find themselves commanding a ship full of desperate people with nothing left to lose. And that is a situation from which no one emerges unscathed. When mutiny does occur, it is often sudden and catastrophically violent. The lower decks erupt first. The bonded labourers and the press-ganged conscripts who have the least to lose and the most to gain from overthrowing the existing order. They seize weapons from the armory if they can, or they improvise weapons from tools and scrap metal if they cannot, and they sweep through the lower levels of the ship like a flood, killing overseers and armsmen and anyone who represents the authority that has ground them down. The armsmen rally to defend the command decks, as sealing blast doors and establishing defensive positions in the corridors that lead to the bridge, and the ship descends into a civil war that plays out in the same close-quarters hell as a boarding action. except that both sides know every inch of the battlefield, because it is the place where they have lived and worked side by side for years. The consequences of a failed mutiny are predictable and severe. The ringleaders are identified, tried by summary court-martial, and executed publicly, usually by spacing. Their accomplices are punished according to their degree of involvement, with penalties ranging from flogging to servitor conversion. The surviving crew is subjected to intensified worship services and ideological conditioning, their every movement watched more closely than before, whilst their small freedoms curtailed until the commissar is satisfied that the seed of rebellion has been thoroughly uprooted. The consequences of a successful mutiny are even worse, because a ship that has overthrown its officers has also, in the eyes of the Imperium, declared itself traitor. There is no appeal, no negotiation, no possibility of rehabilitation. A mutinied ship is declared renegade and hunted by the rest of the fleet, and if it is caught, its crew will face a fate that makes the punishments for a failed mutiny look merciful by comparison. Some mutinied ships flee into the warp, seeking refuge in the Eye of Terror or the Maelstrom, where they join the fleets of the Chaos powers and become the very thing that the Imperium trained them to fight. Others simply run, trying to lose themselves in the vast spaces between the stars, in knowing that the Imperium's memory is long and its reach is longer, and that there is, ultimately, nowhere in the galaxy that is truly beyond the Emperor's gaze. Time does not behave the same way aboard a battleship as it does on a planet. The artificial day-night cycles imposed by the ship's lumens and the watch rotations create a rhythm of their own, but it is a rhythm disconnected from any natural cycle, and its effects on the human mind and body are profound. Without sunrise and sunset, without seasons and weather, and the countless environmental cues that tie a planet-bound person's sense of time to the physical reality around them, time aboard a battleship becomes abstract, a concept measured by watch rotations and duty shifts and the slow accumulation of service years rather than by any lived experience of its passage. Days blur together, weeks lose their definition. Crew members who have served aboard the same vessel for 20 years often cannot accurately estimate how long they have been there without consulting their service records, because one year feels very much like the next when every day is the same cycle of wake, work, eat, pray, sleep, repeated without variation until the concept of before and after begins to lose its meaning. This temporal disconnection is compounded by the effects of warp travel. The immaterium does not observe the same relationship between cause and effect that governs the physical universe, and ships that enter the warp may emerge to find that more or less time has passed in the outside world than the crew experienced during the transit. A journey that felt like 2 weeks aboard the ship might correspond to 6 months in real space or 2 days. The Imperium has developed elaborate systems of record-keeping and date standardization to cope with these discrepancies. But at the individual level, the effect is disorienting and sometimes deeply distressing. A crew member who left a young family behind on their homeworld when they shipped out might return from a campaign to discover that their children have grown old and died, that the world they knew has changed beyond recognition, that the person they were is now a stranger in a place that no longer remembers them. This is why so many long-service crew members stop thinking of themselves as people who come from somewhere else and start thinking of themselves as people who come from the ship. The battleship becomes their world, their nation, their identity, and the life they led before they stepped aboard recedes into memory and then into something less than memory, a story they once heard about someone who might have been them, but probably was not. There is a question that underlies everything we have discussed so far, a question that the Imperium's propaganda and religious institutions work tirelessly to prevent anyone from asking, is it worth it? Is the suffering of the bonded laborers in the gun decks justified by the firepower they enable? Is the isolation of the navigators a fair price for the ability to traverse the stars? Is the degradation of the bilge deck mutants an acceptable consequence of maintaining vessels whose age and complexity exceed human comprehension? is the whole, vast, grinding, but brutal machine of Imperial naval life, justified by the fact that without it, humanity would be consumed by the darkness that presses in from every direction. The Imperium's answer, of course, is yes. The Imperial cult teaches that suffering is service, that sacrifice is worship, that the individual exists to serve the species, and the species exists to serve the emperor. This is not a philosophy that invites questions or tolerates dissent. It is a statement of faith that is reinforced by every institution and every authority aboard the battleship, from the captain on his command throne, to the confessor in the lower deck cathedral, to the armsman who stands ready to enforce compliance with shock maul and shotgun. But the people who actually live this life, the ratings and the engine workers and the gun deck laborers and the void-born children who have never known anything else, they have their own answers, quieter and more personal and perhaps more truthful than anything an imperial bureaucrat or a ministorum preacher could articulate. They endure because they must. They serve because the alternative is worse. But they also, in their own way, find meaning in what they do. The gun deck laborer who takes pride in his crew's loading speed, who knows that when the time comes, his shells will reach the enemy and his ship will survive because he did his job. The rating who has made a friend in the berthing compartment next to hers, a friend who shares her rations when food is short and holds her hand during warp transit when the nightmares come. The tech priest who genuinely believes that the machine spirit in the plasma reactor responds to prayer and who finds a kind of transcendence in the union of flesh and machine that his augmentations represent. The navigator who, despite the isolation and the horror of what they perceive through their third eye, feels a deep satisfaction in guiding 1 million souls safely through the most dangerous medium in existence. These are not grand stories of heroism and glory. They are small, quiet, human stories, and they are the real life of an imperial battleship. The lore and the histories tell us about the battles and the great captains and the decisive engagements that shaped the fate of empires. But the true story of these vessels is written in the everyday lives of the people who live and work and love and suffer within their metal walls. Are people whose names will never appear in any historical record, but without whom none of those grand events would have been possible. We have walked together through the decks of an imperial battleship, from the gilded heights of the command section to the forgotten darkness of the bilge decks. We have breathed the recycled air and tasted the metallic tang of it. We have heard the endless hum of the engines and the distant thunder of the guns. We have met the people who call this impossible place home, the officers and the ratings, the tech priests and the astropaths, the bonded laborers and the bilge dwellers, each one a thread in a fabric woven from duty and faith and suffering and the stubborn, inexhaustible will to survive. That is the defining characteristic of the human species in the 41st millennium. An imperial battleship is many things. It is a weapon of war, certainly, one of the most powerful ever devised by the mind of man. It is a monument to the Imperium's engineering prowess and its willingness to invest unimaginable resources in the tools of its own defense. It is a symbol, massive and unmistakable, of the Imperium's determination to hold the stars against everything that seeks to take them away. But above all, it is a home for hundreds of thousands of souls who live their entire lives within its metal skin, who are born and married and grow old and die without ever feeling natural sunlight on their faces or breathing air that has not been recycled through the same filters 1 million times before. A home that creaks and groans and hums with a voice all its own. A voice that its inhabitants learn to love the way a child loves the sound of a parent's heartbeat. A home that protects them from the infinite hostility of the void, even as it subjects them to hardships that would seem unbearable to anyone who has not lived them. In the grim darkness of the far future, where humanity wages an eternal war for survival against threats that multiply with every passing year, these ships and the people who crew them are the thin line that separates civilization from extinction. They are the Imperium's iron wall, its armored fist, its lifeline to the scattered worlds that make up the greatest human civilization the galaxy has ever known. They are flawed and brutal and magnificent and heartbreaking all at once, and they are, in the end, the most human thing the Imperium has ever built, because at their core, beneath the guns and the armor and the ancient machinery, they are just places where people live. And wherever people live, there is hope. There is a moment that every crew member aboard an Imperial battleship has experienced, whether they have served for 40 years or 4 months. It comes at odd times, unpredictably, without warning. Perhaps you are walking through a corridor during the quiet hours of the night watch, when the ship is at its most peaceful and the hum of the engines seems almost musical. Perhaps you are standing at a viewport, one of the precious few that exist on the habitable decks, watching the stars drift past in their slow, silent procession. Perhaps you're in the cathedral during a service, surrounded by 1,000 other voices raised in a hymn that your grandmother sang and her grandmother before her. It's a chain of voices stretching back through the generations to the very first crew who ever served aboard this vessel. In that moment, something shifts. The weight of the ship, the weight of duty and discipline, and the hierarchy and the endless, grinding cycle of work and sleep and prayer seems to lift just slightly, and you see the thing you are part of not as a burden, but as a wonder. You are inside a machine that sails between the stars. You are part of a crew that has kept this ancient, magnificent, terrible creation alive for longer than most civilizations have existed. You are a thread in a chain of human endeavor that stretches back 10,000 years and forward into a future that you will never see, but that will exist, in part, because of the work you did today. And for that one moment, as standing in the dim amber light of a corridor that smells of machine oil and incense and the breath of 100,000 other people, you understand why the ship is worth serving, and why the service, despite everything it costs, is worth the giving. That moment passes, of course. It always does. The lumen flickers, the engine hum shifts tone, the bosun's whistle calls you back to your duties, and you are once again a rating or a laborer or an officer in the vast machinery of the Imperial Navy, a single cell in the body of a beast that spans a galaxy and eats its children as readily as it defends them. But the memory of that moment stays with you, tucked away in whatever part of your soul the ship has not yet claimed, and it sustains you through the watches and the battles and the long, dark transits through the warp when the Gellerfield hums and the walls seem to breathe, and the only thing between you and the abyss is a layer of ancient technology and a prayer that you mean with every fiber of your being. This is what life aboard an Imperial battleship really is. Not the grand narratives of conquest and sacrifice that fill the history books. Not the sterile diagrams and technical specifications that fill the Mechanicus archives. Not the grim statistics of attrition and mortality that fill the Administratum's endless reports. It is the small, private, impossibly human experience of living inside a machine that was built for war, but has become, through the sheer stubborn persistence of the people who inhabit it, something more. Something that feeds and shelters and terrifies and imprisons and protects and kills and, in its own iron way, loves the people who give their lives to keep it alive. The battleship sails on, as it has always sailed, through the dark between the stars. Its engines burn, its guns stand ready, its crew goes about the business of living, one watch at a time, one prayer at a time, one breath of recycled air at a time. And somewhere in its vast metal belly, a child presses their ear to the wall and listens to the heartbeat of the ship. And the ship, if machines can dream, dreams of the stars. That brings us to the end of this journey through the corridors of an Imperial battleship. If you found this exploration of the grim and fascinating world inside one of the Imperium's greatest warships as absorbing as I found it to narrate, I would deeply appreciate it if you would consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows me to continue diving deep into the lore of the 41st millennium and bringing these stories to life. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, the Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.